So, after we learned that a US soldier was killed in Syria, this prompted President Trump to do something good for the first time in a really long time. He announced that we'd be ending our role in the Syrian war and we'd be bringing the troops home. Now, do I believe what Donald Trump is saying? Not necessarily, but certainly, if he's at least considering this, that's good, and we should be encouraging him, especially now that he has a neocon warmonger like John Bolton as his national security advisor. So this is certainly a step in the right direction. He at least is inclined to want to bring the troops home, which is a huge improvement over his foreign policy since he's been elected. He's just been incredibly neoconservative because he has a lot of neocons advising him. However, we got a taste of how America's corporate media props up the military-industrial complex in the midst of Donald Trump's declaration that we'd be bringing the troops home, because CNN's Jake Tapper released a segment where they literally shamed Donald Trump for wanting to do the right thing. Now, to me, I feel as though this is probably one of the most brazen pro-war propaganda pieces I've seen the mainstream media do in a really long time, and I'm going to show it to you and then we'll break it down.
And we're back with our world lead now. A U.S. soldier was killed last week in Syria. He was on a classified mission, we're told, to kill or capture a known member of ISIS, according to the Pentagon. But now President Trump has stunned advisors by saying he wants to pull all U.S. forces out of Syria, and to do so, quote, very soon. How might that affect the U.S. campaign against ISIS? CNN's Barbara Starr joins me now live from the Pentagon. And Barbara, is the president's national security team backing him on this surprise announcement?
Well, Jake, there is now a national security meeting scheduled for tomorrow to discuss Syria. So far, no rush to agree with the president on any of this. CNN has learned that military plans are in the works that could send dozens of additional U.S. troops to northern Syria, defense officials say, just as President Trump was saying this.
We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now.
The National Security Council meets Tuesday to discuss Syria and the 2,000 U.S. troops there. So far, no one is rushing to agree.
All of his military advisors have said we need to leave troops in Syria.
The White House press secretary again trying to soften Mr. Trump's words.
We want to help, but at the same time, we want other people to step up and put a little skin in the game.
President Trump also has frozen $200 million in recovery funds for Syria for restoring water, power, and roads. An early U.S. pullout will only benefit Iran and Russia, skeptics warn.
Russia also wants to keep their foothold in the Middle East, and the only one that they have right now is really through Syria, so they don't want to give that up.
And Iran could then achieve its goal, a trade route from Tehran to Damascus.
It'd be the single worst decision the president could make.
And if the president goes against Defense Secretary James Mattis and General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs?
I think it's too early to say that, this is the litmus test, that if it doesn't go their way, they walk. But I do think it's going to be very interesting to see what their advice is and the degree to which it's being followed.
Now, Jake, I've talked to at least a dozen officials, and so far, I haven't found anybody who agrees with the president that it's time to get out of Syria. Jake?
Barbara Starr, thank you so much. Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat of Hawaii, joins me now live from Honolulu. Senator, thanks so much for joining us. What do you think? Should President Trump pull U.S. troops out of Syria?
This is yet another example of the president's incoherence, and it's clear that he thrives in chaos. We haven't heard from General Dunford. We haven't heard from General Mattis. And yet this is really on a par with the kind of incoherence that the president exemplifies on a daily basis. And I think in this instance, he's again reacting to what's happening with the Mueller investigation that threatens to close in on him and his associates every day.
I just remember a lot of Republicans being very critical of President Obama when he announced a date certain to start withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And the argument was, well, all the enemy has to do is just wait out President Obama, and then they can start taking over again.
Yes.
Obviously, ultimately, President Obama left troops in Afghanistan, around 9,000 or 10,000. Do you have those same concerns about this announcement from President Trump?
I know that this announcement was, yet again, shoot from the hip. And in the Middle East, it's very dangerous to shoot from the hip, you know, going in, coming out. We need to be very clear about what our goals are, and we haven't gotten that from this administration nor this president. So what does winning look like? What does leaving Syria look like? The entire Middle East is very complicated, and we should understand what's going to happen and what the consequences may be before we shoot from the hip. And unlike the president, the rest of us do not shoot from the hip. That would be totally irresponsible, and it would not support our national security interests at all, in my view.
So there's a lot going on there in that segment. First of all, I want to look at the framing. The whole framing of this issue was that Donald Trump shocked his advisors for wanting to abruptly pull out of Syria. Well, do I believe that his advisors are shocked? Yes, I do. But they shouldn't be that shocked because this was Donald Trump's initial position on the campaign trail. I think that they were just shocked because they weren't able to control what Donald Trump is doing, because Donald Trump obviously has been a puppet of the neoconservatives and the deep state who's been running his administration. So I get that they're shocked. They thought that maybe they had better control over him. But, I mean, if you're shocked that this is his position and what he wants, then maybe you just weren't paying attention. Now, second of all, think about the way that Jake Tapper framed it. He's worried about how this might affect the United States' campaign against ISIS. So from the beginning of this segment, the implication is that this is a bad decision. If we want to pull out of Syria, that's bad, because we are unilaterally disarming in the fight against ISIS. That's the overall implication. He didn't explicitly say this, but he's trying to prime you to think about it this way. Now, second of all, he brought on Barbara Starr, who made a fool of herself during the Abu Ghraib scandal when pictures were released of our military torturing prisoners. Now, she was more outraged at the time that someone violated military policy and took these pictures to begin with, rather than being outraged at the fact that we were torturing people. And even though she's supposed to be a correspondent to the Pentagon for CNN, the late Michael Hastings actually described her as a spokesperson for the Pentagon, because she is someone who consistently does pro-war propaganda. She does propaganda for the Pentagon, so her presence here kind of gives you a hint as to where Jake Tapper wanted to go with this segment. Now, they talked about how nobody in his administration really agrees with this move. They played a clip from infamous warmonger Lindsey Graham, who would invade Canada if you let him, and everything down to the framing was troubling. And when Barbara Starr talked about how pulling out would only benefit Iran and Russia, there was a really big pause before she said the words "skeptics warn," to suggest that it's a fact that Russia and Iran would benefit from this.
Early U.S. pullout will only benefit Iran and Russia, skeptics warn.
And one of the biggest points made in this segment was that we shouldn't bring the troops home. We should keep them in Syria, because if we bring them home, then Iran might get what it finally wants. They want a trade route from Tehran to Damascus. Now, ask yourself this. Would a trade route from Tehran to Damascus affect you in any way whatsoever? No, it wouldn't. Why should we continue to spend $11.5 million every single day on a war that has nothing to do with us when Flint, Michigan still does not have clean drinking water? How would a trade route from Iran to Syria affect you in any way whatsoever? How would Russia and Syria and Iran having more influence affect normal everyday Americans? It wouldn't. And Barbara Starr's implication is that since no top-level White House official agrees with the president, well, then it must be an inherently bad idea. So, because all of the warmongers in Donald Trump's administration don't think this is a good idea, then it's just an inherently bad idea? Really? So, I mean, overall, they want you to think that this is a bad idea, and they're subtly trying to get you to think that this is bad by a lot of implications and innuendo. Now, also, I want to talk about how Jake Tapper brought on Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono. Now, notice that when he asked her if withdrawing was a good idea or not, she wouldn't give him a straight answer as to whether or not we should pull the troops out of Syria.
This is yet another example of the president's incoherence, and it's clear that he thrives in chaos.
Now, the answer is simple. It's an unequivocal yes. When somebody asks you whether or not we should bring the troops home, you answer yes if you're a Democrat. But instead, she did this little tap dance around the question because she didn't want to come out and just say that she supports war in Syria, because she knows that Democrats are supposed to be the anti-war party. So what does she do? She basically implies that she's reserving her judgment until she hears from generals. But ultimately, she takes a stand against Trump here, again, when he's trying to do the right thing, and she criticized Donald Trump and called him incoherent when he wanted to do the right thing.
Incoherence.
That might be the millionth example of a Democrat resisting Donald Trump from the right. You have to be against Donald Trump no matter what, so you resist him even if it's from the right. And Mazie somehow found a way to tie what Donald Trump wants here to the Mueller investigation. How the fuck does wanting to bring troops home from Syria have anything to do with Mueller? Wouldn't it be the case that if Donald Trump wants to distract us from the Mueller investigation, he would start more wars because that's an even bigger distraction? I mean, your logic makes no sense here. Again, she's resisting Donald Trump from the right. Now, going back to Jake Tapper, he actually made the point that Republicans made when Obama was in office about how if ISIS wants to reemerge, they only have to wait until we elect the next president, and then they'll just take over again. But what Mazie should have said here in response to Jake is that the premise of that question is inherently flawed, because if you take that argument and you extend it to its logical conclusion, then we should invade every country ever to make sure that no militant group ever emerges or reemerges. So we should just occupy every country in the world, and then we can guarantee that ISIS or any group will never emerge. And again, it drives me nuts that at a time when Donald Trump has John Bolton as his national security advisor, Democrats are essentially encouraging him to be even more hawkish. The mainstream corporate media is encouraging him to be even more hawkish. And let me ask you this. We have 2,000 American troops in Syria right now. Do you remember Congress voting to approve this war? Because I certainly don't. So not only are we not authorized to be there because Congress did not authorize this war, but we're there when we have no business being there. What goes on in Syria does not affect us. Now, if you are going to cover this issue in a non-propagandist way, you tell the American people about how much it costs to be in Syria. We're spending $11.5 million per day. That's more than $4 billion per year fighting a war that doesn't concern us whatsoever. You tell the American people the truth about ISIS and that they've been nearly wiped out. Why would we stay there so we can overthrow Assad only to fight the next group of militants that rise to prominence due to the vacuum that we create by taking him out in the first place? You have to tell the American people the truth about these sort of things. You have to tell them that we're technically fighting both sides of the war. We're against ISIS, but we're also against Assad, who's fighting ISIS. So we shouldn't be there. And if the question is posed to you whether or not we should withdraw, certainly if you're part of the anti-war party, the Democrats, you say, yes, we should withdraw. Now, this segment is incredibly problematic, but it's just a microcosm of the broader issue with the mainstream corporate media, because this has a really strong effect on the American people. And to show you how that's the case, in 2013, a majority of Americans actually opposed military action in Syria, such as missile strikes. But in 2017, 51% supported Donald Trump's illegal strikes on a Syrian airfield, according to a HuffPost and YouGov survey. And that's the disastrous effect that war propaganda has on the American people. If you beat citizens over the head with this certain narrative, with this pro-war narrative, over a time, you can manufacture a consensus for what the government wants. Now, ask yourself this, CNN, as a corporate media outlet, what do they have to gain by us staying in Syria? And the answer is simple, money. Their advertisers are defense contractors, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. So if they speak out against the war, if they actually cover this in an objective way, what would happen? Well, they would upset their defense contractor advertisers. Boeing would pull out, Lockheed Martin would pull out. So that's why they cover this in a pro-war way. They try to imply that pulling out is a bad decision, inherently so, and they try to make it seem as though they're being neutral and that they're reporting on this objectively when they're not doing that. If they were reporting on this objectively, they would tell you the cost of war, the real cost of war, both monetarily and in terms of human life. But they don't do that because they care more about money than bloodshed. And that's why we have to be extremely cautious when we tune into mainstream media, because you might be getting a false narrative, a propaganda, pro-war narrative, and you don't even know it.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.